The sky was dark, and the sea was wild. The year was 1229, and the night was filled with the sound of crashing waves and the creaking of wooden ships. King James I of Aragon stood on the deck of his flagship, gazing out at the vast fleet that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sails of the ships were so numerous that the sea seemed to turn white under the moonlight. James was a man of great ambition, and tonight he was about to change the course of history. For years, James had been a king in name only. He had faced rebellions and a long minority. But now, at the age of 28, he was ready to take control. His heart was set on the Balearic Islands, particularly Majorca, which was a strategic prize in the Mediterranean. The great merchant families of Barcelona had pushed for a naval campaign, and James saw his chance to expand his kingdom and secure his legacy. The fleet set sail from Barcelona in September, and for months the ships braved the storms and the winds. Finally, on the last day of the year, they reached the shores of Palma. The city was a fortress with high walls and a determined Muslim governor, but James was not deterred. He knew that this was his moment. The attack began at dawn. The Aragonese soldiers, armed with swords and shields, stormed the beaches. The battle was fierce, with the defenders fighting valiantly to protect their home. But the sheer number of the attackers and their determination proved too much. By the end of the day, Palma had fallen. The Muslim governor was captured, and the royal banner of Aragon was raised over the city. James wrote in his autobiography, The Liberdel's Fates, that when he saw his standard on the tower, he dismounted, turned towards the east, and wept with joy, kissing the ground for the great mercy that had been done to him. It was a moment of triumph, but it was just the beginning. In the following years, James continued his conquests. Majorca submitted to Aragonese rule in 1231, paying tribute but maintaining a degree of independence. In 1235, Ibiza and Formentera were also brought under Aragonese control. These victories were crucial, as they gave James command of the sea, which he would use to his advantage in his next great campaign. With the Balearic Islands secured, James turned his attention to the mainland. Valencia, a rich and powerful city, was his ultimate goal. The city was in turmoil, with frequent changes in leadership and internal strife. James saw this as an opportunity to strike. In 1236, he laid siege to Valencia. The city was well fortified, but James had a secret weapon: control of the sea. His recent conquests in the Balearic Islands allowed him to blockade the city, preventing any relief from reaching it. The siege lasted for 2 years, but in 1238, the city finally surrendered. The royal banner of Aragon was raised once again, and James entered the city in triumph. Valencia was a significant prize, and its capture marked a turning point in James's reign. He continued to push south, taking Alcira in 1242 and Jàtava in 1243. By the time of his death in 1276, James had nearly doubled the size of his kingdom, creating an Aragonese-Catalan maritime empire that stretched across the Mediterranean. While James was building his empire in the east, another powerful kingdom was rising in the west, Castile. Under King Fernando III, Castile was also expanding its territory, but the path was different. Fernando's reign began with the reunification of Castile and Leon in 1230, a union that gave him control of a vast territory stretching from the north to the Guadiana River in the south. Fernando's success was supported by the church, particularly by Archbishop Rodrigo Jiménez de Reda of Toledo. Rodrigo was a short but influential figure, known for his oratory and administrative skills. He organized the support of the church for Fernando's campaigns, using his influence to rally the Christian armies. One of Fernando's greatest victories came in 1236, when he captured Córdoba. The city was a jewel of Islamic civilization, known for its grand mosque and its rich cultural heritage. A group of Christian soldiers had infiltrated the city and taken control of a suburb, appealing to Fernando for help. Despite the rain and the distance, Fernando rushed to the scene, laid siege to the city, and eventually took it. The mosque was converted into a cathedral, and the bells that had been taken from Santiago de Compostela were returned. The final and most significant victory of Fernando's reign was the capture of Seville in 1248. Seville was the last major city in al-Andalus to fall to the Christians, and its capture marked the end of Muslim dominance in the region. The siege was long and brutal, with both the besieged and the besiegers suffering from drought, hunger, and disease. The turning point came when Fernando's fleet, led by Ramon Bonifaz, cut the pontoon bridge that connected Seville to the outside world. Without supplies or reinforcements, the city's defenses crumbled. Fernando's terms were harsh. Every Muslim had to leave the city, taking only what they could carry. The city, once a vibrant center of Islamic culture, was left desolate and silent. When Fernando entered Seville on December 22, 1248, he found a ghost town, a stark reminder of the power of Christian conquest. The fall of Seville marked the end of an era. The poet Arundi, a witness to the event, wrote a poignant elegy that captured the sorrow and loss felt by the Muslim population. He lamented the fall of the great cities of al-Andalus, the desecration of the mosques, and the forced exodus of the Muslim population. The loss of Seville was more than just a military defeat. It was the end of a cultural and intellectual tradition that had flourished for centuries. But the story of the conquests of James I and Fernando III was not just a tale of Christian triumph. It was also a story of the complex interactions between different cultures and the gradual transformation of the Iberian Peninsula. The legacy of these conquests would shape the future of Spain, influencing its politics, culture, and identity for generations to come. Averroes, a great thinker from the 12th century, believed that the people of al-Andalus, which is present-day Spain, shared a lot in common with the ancient Greeks because they lived in similar conditions. By Averroes' time, the works of ancient Greek scientists and philosophers, like Aristotle, Galen, and others, had been translated into Arabic and were being studied. This was a big deal because it meant that the knowledge of the past was available to a new generation of scholars. Averroes was especially interested in Aristotle. He thought Aristotle was a perfect example of human intelligence, and believed that Aristotle's works were given to us by God to help us understand the world. Averroes spent a lot of time writing commentaries on Aristotle's works, covering topics like astronomy, biology, medicine, and ethics. He also wrote about Plato's Republic. One of Averroes' biggest challenges was figuring out how to fit the ideas of Greek philosophy with the teachings of Islam. Islam is based on the belief that all knowledge comes from God and is written in the Quran. But Greek philosophers like Aristotle suggested that we could understand the world through observation and reasoning, without needing to refer to God. This was a tricky situation, but Averroes didn't shy away from it. He wrote a book called On the Harmony of Religion and Philosophy, which tried to show that faith and reason could coexist. Averroes' ideas were not just important in al-Andalus, they also had a big impact in Christian Europe. In the 13th and 14th centuries, European scholars were also trying to understand how the ideas of the ancient Greeks fit with their own religious beliefs. They found Averroes' work very helpful. Thomas Aquinas, a famous Christian philosopher, cited Averroes over 500 times in his own writings. In Dante's Inferno, Averroes is even mentioned as the great commentator. Now, let's talk about the Muslim communities that lived under Christian rule in Spain during the 12th and 13th centuries. This period is often called convivencia, which means living together. It's a term that describes how Muslims, Christians, and Jews tried to coexist in the same areas. This wasn't a new idea, though. Similar situations had existed in other parts of the world, like in Sicily and the Crusader states in the Middle East. However, living together wasn't always easy. There were often tensions between the different groups. For example, King James I of Aragon said that Muslims were traitors who always tried to harm Christians. King Sancho IV of Castile said that Muslims were like dogs and had different beliefs about what was good and bad. On the other side, a Muslim scholar named Yabir said that Muslims shouldn't adopt Christian practices. Sometimes when a town was conquered, there were violent outbreaks. For example, when the Portuguese captured the city of Santarém in 1147, many people were killed, but often, people were too valuable to just kill. Instead, they were made into slaves. Both Muslims and Christians took slaves from each other. In 1287, when the Aragonese took the island of Majorca, they sold the entire population into slavery. Despite these challenges, many Muslims chose to stay in their homes, even after they came under Christian rule. They were called mudejars, which means people allowed to remain. The Christian rulers created laws called fueros that set out how the mudejars should be treated. These laws often allowed Mudéjars to keep their property, practice their religion, and live according to Islamic law. However, in practice, the Mudéjars often faced discrimination. They couldn't participate in the general government of the cities where they lived. Sometimes they had to live in separate areas. In lawsuits, they often had a harder time than Christians. For example, in the city of Toledo, if a Christian and a Muslim had a legal dispute, the case would be heard by a Christian court. The Mudéjars also faced restrictions on what clothes they could wear and who they could have relationships with. For instance, if a Muslim man had a relationship with a Christian woman, he could be stoned to death. Despite these challenges, the Mudéjars made significant contributions to the culture and society of medieval Spain. They were skilled in crafts like weaving and metalwork, and they helped maintain the rich cultural heritage of al-Andalus even under Christian rule. The life of the Mudéjar communities in medieval Spain was a delicate balance of freedom and control. While the Mudéjars, the Muslims living under Christian rule, were granted the right to continue their worship, they faced numerous restrictions and pressures that shaped their daily lives. One of the most significant restrictions was the ban on Islamic proselytizing. Any attempt to convert Christians to Islam was strictly forbidden and could result in severe punishment, including the death penalty. This was a reciprocal rule, as Christian efforts to convert Muslims in al-Andalus were also prohibited. Mudéjars were required to participate in certain Christian practices, such as not working on Sundays, the Christian Sabbath. They also had to show respect to Christian religious symbols. For example, they were required to kneel when a Christian priest carried the host during a procession. Despite these constraints, forced conversions to Christianity were not the norm. Alfonso X, the King of Castile, emphasized that conversions should be voluntary, reflecting earlier Christian teachings that God prefers willing followers rather than those who convert out of fear. However, this ideal was not always reflected in practice. Some Mudéjars converted through supernatural events, like the story of a deaf mute who miraculously gained speech and hearing, leading to several conversions in the Cathedral of Toledo. Other conversions were motivated by more practical reasons, such as the promise of freedom for enslaved Mudéjars who converted to Christianity. However, this promise was often not honored, especially when it conflicted with the interests of slave owners. The Mudéjars also faced pressure to assimilate into Christian culture, particularly in language. While Arabic remained the language of the Mudéjars, it gradually gave way to the Romance languages that evolved into Castilian, Portuguese, and Catalan. By the 15th century, many Mudéjars could no longer read Arabic, as evidenced by Issa Yebir, who wrote a compendium of Islamic law in Castilian because so few of his fellow Muslims could read Arabic. The distribution of Mudéjar communities varied across the peninsula. In the northern regions such as Navarre and Old Castile, Mudéjars were relatively scarce, often found only as slaves. In Aragon, they made up about a quarter of the population, but were mostly rural and quickly assimilated. In Valencia, however, Mudéjars were a significant majority, maintaining their Islamic faith and Arabic language well into the 16th century. In the southern regions, the situation was more complex. In Andalusia, Mudéjars were present in many towns, sometimes in modest numbers and other times in substantial communities. After the Christian conquest, some Mudéjars were expelled, but others were encouraged to return to help rebuild and repopulate the cities. For example, in Seville, the Mudéjars who returned included skilled craftsmen like saddlers and toy makers, essential for the city's economic recovery. Despite the challenges, the Mudéjars made significant contributions to medieval Spanish society. They excelled in various crafts, such as pottery, carpentry, and textile work. Their architectural skills are evident in the beautiful brick and stucco decorations found in buildings like the Castle of Coca and the Alcazar of Seville. The Mudéjars' influence is also seen in the thousands of Arabic loanwords that became part of the Castilian, Portuguese, and Catalan languages. The relationship between Mudéjars and Christians was not always strained. There were instances of friendly interactions, such as Christians taking their Muslim friends to Mass or hiring Mudéjar musicians to play in churches. However, the Mudéjars generally held lower social statuses, often working as farmers, shepherds, and skilled laborers. The Christian conquerors need to resettle and secure the land after the conquest, heavily influenced the treatment of the Mudéjars. Settlement was crucial to prevent the return of Islamic rule, and the Mudéjars, despite their restrictions, played a vital role in this process. Their presence and contributions helped stabilize and develop the newly conquered territories, even as they navigated a complex and often challenging social landscape. The scale of the problem must be appreciated. Under Alfonso el Batallador, who ruled from 1104 to 1134, the Kingdom of Aragon doubled in size. This expansion continued under James I, who ruled from around 1230 to 1260, doubling the size of the monarchy again. Meanwhile, Castile, which had stopped at the Tagus River in 1100, pushed all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar by 1250. The question was, where would all the settlers come from to populate these new lands? In the early days, when the Leonese and Castilians were settling the central Meseta, and the Catalans were moving into the Llobregat and Penedès regions, the settlers came from the mountainous areas in the north of the Iberian Peninsula. This area, stretching from the Pyrenees through Cantabria to Galicia, was surprisingly densely populated during the 9th and 10th centuries. People from these mountainous regions moved down to the plains, bringing with them the strength and resilience needed to build and defend the new Christian settlements. You can still see evidence of this migration in the Basque place names found in Old Castile. However, this source of settlers began to dry up by the 11th century. From around 1070, a new wave of colonists started arriving from beyond the Pyrenees, primarily from France. While the French made up the majority of these newcomers, they were not the only ones. Italians, especially from Genoa, were drawn to the commercial opportunities in Spain. They set up offices in Seville and explored the Atlantic, even venturing as far as the Canaries and the West African coast. In 1291, the Genoese brothers Vivaldi set out for India, but were never heard from again. Despite this, the Genoese presence remained significant in Spain's commercial history for the next 2 centuries. Settlers also came from even further away. For example, the Anglo-Norman Burdets established a principality near Tarragona, where they were responsible for defense and resettlement. Gilbert Anglicus, an Englishman, arrived in Tortosa in 1148, after helping to capture it from the Muslims. He did well for himself, contributing to public works and lending money to the Montcades, the most powerful family in Catalonia. In 1172, Gilbert entered the monastery of Santas Cruz, leaving behind a will that revealed the presence of other Englishmen in the area. He even provided a dowry for his niece, Adeliza, back in England, showing the connections between these settlers and their home countries. The church played a significant role in resettlement as well. New religious orders like the Cistercians were keen to settle in remote and difficult areas. Rulers like Afonso Henriques of Portugal supported them, often with generous land grants. For instance, the Cistercian monastery of Alcobaça in Portugal was founded in 1153, with the condition that the monks must settle the land or forfeit it. In the 13th century, the Franciscans and Dominicans focused on urban areas, helping to spiritually colonize cities in Andalusia. The 12th and 13th centuries were a time of population growth across Europe, and this helped meet the demand for settlers in the Iberian Peninsula. However, the 14th century brought disasters like poor harvests, famine, and the Black Death, which significantly reduced the population. This made it harder to find enough settlers. Some towns and cities, like Medina Sidonia, struggled to attract new residents. The fueros, or charters, offered incentives to attract settlers, sometimes even welcoming criminals and outlaws. Despite these challenges, the Christian authorities needed the Mudéjars, or Muslims living under Christian rule, to stay and help colonize the new lands. In Valencia, the Mudéjars played a significant role in rural areas, but in Castile and Portugal, they often did not. This led to an increase in livestock, especially sheep, which required less labor. The development of transhumant pastoralism, where sheep were moved between winter and summer pastures, became a major economic activity. The military orders, like the Order of Santiago, owned vast estates and became powerful ranching corporations. The merino sheep, introduced in the mid-13th century, produced high-quality wool, which was in great demand. The Mesta, an organization protecting the interests of sheep farmers, became a key player in Spain's economy. The intellectual and cultural landscape also underwent significant changes during this period. Western scholars began to discover and appropriate the vast knowledge of the Islamic world. Gerbert of Aurillac, who later became Pope Sylvester II, studied in Spain in the 960s and brought back mathematical knowledge, including the use of the abacus. The abacus, a tool for rapid and accurate calculations, revolutionized fields like architecture, music, and government finance. Other scholars, like Peter Alfonso, a Jewish convert to Christianity, and Adelard of Bath, translated important Islamic works into Latin, making them accessible to European scholars. These translations included astronomical tables and mathematical treatises, which had a profound impact on European learning. The influx of settlers, the role of the church, and the exchange of knowledge all contributed to the transformation of the Iberian Peninsula during the 12th and 13th centuries. Despite the challenges, this period saw significant growth and development, laying the foundation for the future of Spain. The story of how the West rediscovered and embraced the vast wealth of learning from the Greco-Arabian tradition is a tale of individual effort, chance, and the relentless curiosity of scholars. In the 12th and 13th centuries, two main gateways to this knowledge were the Christian kingdoms of Spain and the Norman principalities in southern Italy and Sicily. While the Crusader states in Syria and Palestine existed, they contributed little to the intellectual revival. In Italy, the focus was on translating Greek works directly into Latin. One of the most notable figures here was James of Venice, who, in the early 1100s, translated many of Aristotle's works from the original Greek. In Spain, the emphasis was on translating Arabic works, often Arabic translations or commentaries on Greek texts, into Latin. A prime example of this is the work of Michael Scott, a Scottish scholar who translated commentaries by the Islamic philosopher Averroes on Aristotle's works while working in Toledo in the early 1200s. The translation movement was not a coordinated effort, but rather a series of individual initiatives. Scholars worked independently, often unaware of each other's efforts, leading to duplication. For instance, Ptolemy's astronomical masterpiece, the Almagest, was translated from Greek by Henry Aristippus in Sicily in 1160, while Gerard of Cremona was simultaneously translating it from Arabic in Toledo. This chaotic scene makes it challenging for modern historians to piece together the details, but the dedication of these scholars has been invaluable. Gerard of Cremona, an Italian who moved to Toledo around 1140, is a standout figure in this movement. He was driven by a love for the Almagest, which he could not find in Latin. In Toledo, he found a wealth of Arabic texts and learned the language to translate them. Over his lifetime, he translated around 70 works, covering a wide range of subjects from medicine to astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. His methods involved working with an assistant, Galib the Mozarab, who translated the Arabic text orally, which Gerard then wrote in Latin. Despite the lack of formal support, Gerard's translations were crucial in enriching the intellectual landscape of the Latin West. Another significant translator was Michael Scott, who enjoyed the patronage of Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez de Reda in Spain, and later served Emperor Frederick II in Italy. Michael's translations of Aristotle's works and Averroes' commentaries were influential. He even became Frederick's astrologer and alchemist, and his work may have contributed to the emperor's famous treatise on falconry, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus. By the late 1200s, the work of these translators had laid a solid foundation for the Western world. The influx of new ideas, particularly from Aristotle, sparked intense academic debates, especially in centers like the University of Paris. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas eventually showed that reason and faith could coexist, paving the way for a more harmonious approach to knowledge. The impact of this new learning was profound. It influenced various fields, from medicine and law to architecture and natural science. The work of scholars like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon on optics and other scientific topics marked the beginning of what we now call the scientific method. This period laid the groundwork for the scientific and industrial revolutions of later centuries, showing that these advancements were the culmination of a long process rather than sudden breakthroughs. Amidst this intellectual ferment, there were also early attempts to understand the religious beliefs of the Muslim. In 1142, Peter the Venerable, the Abbot of Cluny, commissioned the first Latin translation of the Quran by Robert of Ketton. Peter's goal was to use this knowledge to refute Islam, but the translation itself was a significant step. Later, in the early 1200s, Mark, a canon of Toledo, produced another translation of the Quran and other Islamic texts, though these also had limited circulation. These efforts reflect a growing interest in dialogue and mission among some Christian scholars. For example, St. Francis preached to the Sultan of Egypt in 1219, and the Franciscan order initially encouraged missionary work among Muslims. The Trinitarians and Mercedarians, religious orders founded to ransom Christian captives, also played a role in this evolving relationship. In the end, the translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries was a pivotal moment in history. It bridged the gap between ancient and medieval worlds, fostering a renaissance of learning that would shape the future of Western civilization. The curiosity and dedication of these scholars ensured that the knowledge of the Greeks and Arabs would not be lost, but would instead become a cornerstone of European thought and scientific progress.